You're standing in a room where the air feels heavy. The cameras are clicking. The person across from you is a native speaker, a dominant personality, and they've just used a word like gambling or failure to describe your life's work.
Your heart rate spikes. Your grammar starts to feel shaky. You know what you want to say, but the power gap in the room feels like a canyon.
Most people think English fluency is about vocabulary. They're wrong.
In the rooms where history is made, and in the boardrooms where your career is decided, fluency isn't the prize. Strategy is.
Welcome to English Between the Lines. I'm Liam.
And I'm Emma.
Today, we aren't just teaching you how to speak, we're teaching you how to survive the room. We're dissecting the explosive February 2025 Oval Office meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky to show you the invisible linguistic weapons used in high-stakes negotiations.
From the alpha body language of the White House to the silent power moves of a Saudi boardroom, we're decoding the secrets of conversational judo.
Grab your coffee, lean in, let's look between the lines. When you watch that Oval Office meeting from 2025 carefully, what becomes immediately fascinating is not only the political tension inside the room, but the invisible architecture of the conversation itself. Because before we even begin analyzing the words that are exchanged between the participants, there is already a kind of psychological battlefield forming in the background, where expectations, assumptions, and rhetorical strategies are quietly colliding with each other.
That's exactly what struck me the first time I watched it, because I kept thinking that Zelensky walked into that room expecting something closer to a strategic discussion about cooperation, particularly around what analysts were calling a possible minerals for aid arrangement. Yet almost immediately, the tone of the room shifts from diplomacy to confrontation, and suddenly the entire interaction feels less like a negotiation and more like a test of psychological endurance.
And what makes the situation even more interesting from a linguistic perspective is that Zelensky has spent years perfecting a very specific communication strategy when speaking English internationally, one that relies heavily on inclusive language and shared identity building, where he frequently uses pronouns like we, our, and together to subtly construct a sense of global solidarity around Ukraine's situation.
Right, and that strategy has often worked remarkably well when he speaks to international audiences or Western leaders, because inclusive language tends to invite listeners into a shared moral narrative. But in this particular room, the dynamic is radically different, especially once figures like Donald Trump begin reframing the conversation in terms that sound far more transactional than collaborative.
Exactly, because when Trump delivers a line like, "You're either going to make a deal or we're out," he's doing something rhetorically very powerful, which is transforming the entire framework of the meeting from a partnership discussion into a negotiation of leverage, effectively repositioning Zelensky from a partner to a petitioner.
And you can almost feel the temperature of the conversation change at that exact moment, because Zelensky's language is still trying to appeal to shared interests and mutual security, while Trump's framing suggests something closer to a transactional calculation of gain and loss.
Which is why the statement, "You're gambling with World War III," becomes such an important moment in the conversation, because linguistically, it functions not simply as a warning, but as what communication theorists call a face-threatening act, a phrase designed to publicly challenge the authority and judgment of the other speaker.
And when that kind of statement enters a conversation, it subtly forces the other person into a defensive posture, because the debate is no longer about policy details, but about credibility, leadership, and responsibility on a global stage.
If we step away from the words themselves and examine the physical choreography of the room, we begin to notice another layer of communication that unfolds almost silently, because body language often communicates power relationships much faster than spoken language ever could.
Yes, and the room almost feels like a pressure chamber from the start, because every movement seems slightly amplified by the tension, which is why many observers later describe the atmosphere as something resembling what psychologists call aggressive arousal, where participants are already operating in a heightened emotional state before the conversation truly begins.
One of the most revealing aspects of that scene is the near absence of mirroring, which in most cooperative conversations appears naturally as participants unconsciously imitate each other's posture, gestures, or rhythm of speech, thereby creating a subtle sense of alignment and mutual understanding.
But in this meeting, the mirroring effect seems almost completely absent, because while Trump and JD Vance appear surprisingly synchronized in their gestures and posture, Zelensky seems physically disconnected from that rhythm, almost as if he is operating on a different conversational frequency.
Exactly. And that synchronization between the American participants becomes particularly visible through gestures such as palms down hand movements, which body language experts often interpret as signals of authority, because palms down gestures symbolically communicate control over the conversation.
Meanwhile, Zelensky's posture gradually becomes more compressed, with his shoulders slightly leaning inward and his hands remaining relatively low, which unintentionally reduces the visual space he occupies in the room.
And then there's that moment when Trump begins pointing with his index finger in a repetitive motion while speaking, which is considered by many communication analysts to be a form of territorial intrusion, because the gesture symbolically pushes into the personal boundary of the other speaker.
Yes, and when Zelensky places his hand over his chest in response, the intention clearly seems to be to communicate sincerity or moral conviction. Yet, within the competitive visual language of that room, it unfortunately reads as a softer signal compared to the more dominant gestures surrounding him.
If we move from physical gestures back into the linguistic structure of the conversation, one of the most revealing patterns appears in the distribution of pronouns throughout the dialogue, which becomes particularly obvious when Trump tells Zelensky, "You don't have the cards."
That sentence alone almost feels like a metaphorical shift of the entire conversation into the language of gambling or poker, where the interaction is no longer about cooperation, but about leverage, advantage, and who supposedly controls the outcome of the situation.
And statistical analysis of the dialogue actually reinforces this impression, because the American side uses the pronoun you dramatically more often than we, which linguistically isolates Zelensky rather than incorporating him into a shared narrative.
Which is fascinating when you consider that Zelensky's usual rhetorical style is built around the opposite principle, because throughout the war, he has consistently emphasized phrases like our shared values or our collective responsibility.
Another subtle yet important detail emerges in the rhythm of speech, because when the pressure increases, Zelensky's vocal pitch rises slightly, which is a common physiological reaction for non-native speakers processing language under stress.
Meanwhile, Trump maintains a comparatively slow and steady vocal register, which creates an impression of calm dominance because audiences often subconsciously associate lower vocal frequencies with authority and confidence.
So, the natural question for our listeners becomes this. If you are a non-native English speaker suddenly placed inside a high-pressure conversation like this one, how can you maintain your composure and authority even when the linguistic terrain feels hostile?
Exactly, because moments like this are not limited to world leaders in the Oval Office. They happen every day in business meetings, interviews, and negotiations where someone feels linguistically outmatched.
The first strategy we recommend is what we call the time buyer, which allows you to regain cognitive control over the conversation. That's a very important point, and I want to make sure I respond to it accurately.
This phrase creates a psychological pause that gives your brain time to organize your thoughts while still projecting confidence and seriousness.
The second strategy is the pivot, which gently redirects the conversation. I understand the concern you're raising. However, the evidence we are seeing suggests a different perspective.
Then there is the clarifier, which can be extremely effective when someone speaks aggressively. Just to be certain I understand correctly, are you saying that…
The fourth strategy is the respectful challenge, which allows disagreement without escalation. I appreciate the perspective you're offering, but my responsibility requires me to approach the issue from another angle.
And finally, there is the diplomatic rejection, sometimes called the no without the no. I'm afraid that option isn't feasible in the current circumstances.
And this leads us to the most important insight of today's episode, because when people learn a second language, they often believe that perfect grammar is the ultimate goal, when in reality, the deeper skill is learning how to manage the emotional geometry of a conversation.
Which means that even if your grammar is not flawless, your strategy, your pacing, and your composure can still allow you to control the room.
Fluency is a tool,
But strategy…
is the weapon. All right, Emma, let's shift the lens away from the Oval Office for a moment, because while analyzing the rhetorical dynamics between leaders like Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky is fascinating from a geopolitical perspective, most of our listeners are not standing behind presidential podiums or negotiating international alliances, but instead sitting inside glass-walled conference rooms in cities like London, Tokyo, Singapore, or New York, where the stakes might be smaller in scale, but the psychological dynamics of dominance, interruption, and linguistic pressure are remarkably similar.
Exactly. And that's why I love running simulations, because the moment you remove the political theater and place those same conversational dynamics into a boardroom setting, people suddenly realize that the strategies we're discussing today apply directly to everyday professional situations, especially for non-native English speakers who often feel that their credibility depends entirely on their grammatical precision rather than their strategic communication.
So let's imagine a realistic scenario, because stories teach faster than theory. Picture a non-native English speaker named Sophie, a finance manager, presenting a Q3 budget proposal to a room full of executives. And across from her sits Marcus, the type of senior executive who communicates authority not only through his words, but through subtle signals like checking his watch, leaning back in his chair, and interrupting presentations halfway through a sentence.
Yes, the classic dominance performer, the kind of person who creates pressure simply by occupying the room with impatience. And that's exactly the kind of moment where many non-native speakers suddenly feel their mental processing slow down, because they're trying to translate ideas, monitor their grammar, and manage the emotional atmosphere all at the same time.
So let me play Marcus for a moment. Sophie has just reached her second slide, explaining the projected allocation for research and marketing, and suddenly Marcus leans back in his chair, folds his arms, glances briefly at the clock, and interrupts her with a slightly dismissive tone. Look, I'm gonna stop you right there, because this budget feels bloated. It looks like we're gambling with company resources on something that might not even materialize. Why exactly should I sign off on this?
Ouch, that is a textbook face-threatening act, because Marcus is not only questioning the numbers, he's indirectly questioning Sophie's competence in front of the entire room. And notice how he uses the metaphor of gambling, which immediately reframes her proposal as risky speculation rather than calculated strategy.
Exactly, and this is the precise moment where many non-native English speakers panic, because the sudden interruption destabilizes their cognitive rhythm, which often leads to fragmented sentences or rushed explanations. Yet the most effective move in this situation is actually to slow the conversation down rather than speed it up.
Right, and this is where Sophie needs what we call a cognitive buffer, which is essentially a short sentence that buys her a few seconds of thinking time while still projecting calm authority to the rest of the room.
So instead of reacting defensively, she looks directly at Marcus, keeps her posture open, and says in a composed voice, "That's a very fair concern to raise, Marcus, and I want to make sure I address the gambling aspect specifically before we move to the next slide."
That's a brilliant move, because by repeating his word, gambling, she subtly neutralizes its emotional charge while signaling that she has heard the criticism and is prepared to respond thoughtfully rather than defensively.
But Marcus is not finished yet because dominant speakers often escalate when they sense resistance. So he leans forward slightly and says, "It's not just a concern, it's the reality. The ROI isn't there. You're giving me a lot of 'we hope.' What I need is a 'we will.'"
And this is where Sophie must perform what I like to call conversational judo, because if she matches his aggression, she will lose credibility. But if she redirects the energy of his criticism toward objective data, she can regain control of the discussion.
Exactly. So she calmly responds, "I understand the concern about certainty. However, the historical data from our previous campaigns suggest an average 15% increase in customer acquisition when this strategy is implemented, which means that based on those patterns, we could expect a full return by Q4.
And I love the fact that she uses the modal verb could, because that single word acts as a linguistic hedge, allowing her to present a confident projection while protecting herself from future uncertainty if the market conditions shift.
But Marcus is attempting a different dominance tactic, the classic sidelining maneuver, where he looks away from Sophie and addresses another executive in the room, saying, "JD, don't you think this is just the same old game we've seen before?"
Yes, and that moment is extremely dangerous for Sophie because it risks making her invisible in her own presentation, which is why she needs to pull the conversational spotlight back toward the original question.
So she uses a clarifying strategy and says, "Just to make sure we're aligned, Marcus, are you suggesting that the current market volatility makes any investment in this area too risky, or is it specifically our entry strategy that you're questioning?"
And that is the turning point, because by asking a precise clarifying question, she forces Marcus to shift from vague criticism to concrete reasoning, which neutralizes the emotional pressure he was creating.
Exactly, and suddenly the conversation moves from a power performance to an analytical discussion.
And now imagine the final moment of the meeting when Marcus says in a slightly skeptical tone, "Fine, refine the numbers and come back to me. I'm not convinced yet."
This is where Sophie must avoid the common mistake of simply saying "okay," because that response would surrender her authority over the timeline.
Instead, she anchors her response in her professional responsibility and says, "I appreciate the feedback, Marcus. However, waiting another month could mean missing the Q4 launch window, and part of my responsibility to the project is making sure we stay aligned with that timeline. I'll have the updated projections ready for you tomorrow so we can keep moving forward. Does that work for you?"
And that, Emma, is the real victory, because she just transformed a skeptical response into a deadline that she controls.
Exactly, which proves that effective communication in English is not about sounding perfect, but about maintaining strategic composure under pressure.
Now, Emma, here's where things become even more fascinating, because everything we've discussed so far assumes a Western communication environment. Yet the moment you place those same strategies into a completely different cultural framework, say a meeting in Riyadh, Tokyo, or Shanghai, the entire logic of dominance can change.
Exactly, because in Western business culture, particularly in countries like the United States or Germany, communication tends to be what anthropologists call low context, meaning that clarity, directness, and speed are interpreted as signs of honesty and competence.
Whereas in high-context cultures such as Japan or many parts of the Middle East, the most important information in a conversation is often communicated indirectly through tone, pauses, and social hierarchy, rather than explicit statements.
And this difference can create incredible misunderstandings, because a Western executive might think that direct confrontation demonstrates leadership, while in a high-context culture, that same behavior can appear impulsive or disrespectful.
Which brings us to one of my favorite cultural contrasts, the role of silence.
Yes, because in many Western boardrooms, a 5-second pause makes people deeply uncomfortable, whereas in countries like Finland or Japan, that silence can actually signal reflection, authority, and emotional control.
So the person who can sit calmly in that silence often appears to hold the most power in the room.
Which means that the true lesson here is that dominance is not a universal behavior, but a cultural code that must be interpreted differently depending on the environment.
Cultural simulation, Japan, the face versus the fact. Let's imagine a German project manager named Hana meeting with a senior Japanese executive named Mr. Tanaka to discuss a delay in a software rollout.
And Hana, being very direct and efficiency-oriented, begins the conversation by saying, "Mr. Tanaka, we have a serious problem with the timeline. The development team is behind schedule, and unless we shorten the testing phase, we will miss the launch date."
Mr. Tanaka pauses, looks down at his notes, inhales slowly, and responds, "It is difficult. The timeline is indeed important."
Which in high-context communication actually means no, and I'm uncomfortable with the way this question was asked.
Exactly, because Hana unintentionally forced him into a yes or no decision in front of his colleagues, which risks damaging his social authority.
So the corrected version sounds very different.
Hana adjusts her tone and says, "Mr. Tanaka, while reviewing the development progress, I noticed some complexities emerging in the testing phase, and I would greatly value your perspective on how we might preserve the quality standards you expect while still protecting the launch timeline."
And now Mr. Tanaka can respond with dignity.
He nods slowly and says, "Quality is very important to us. Perhaps we should review the secondary features and discuss the timeline again with a smaller group."
Which is often the hidden signal that the real decision will take place later in a quieter environment.
Because in many cultures, the boardroom is simply the stage, while the real negotiation happens in private conversations afterward. The Saudi boardroom breakdown. Emma, one of the most fascinating moments in cross-cultural communication happens when professionals who have been trained inside highly direct, low-context communication environments suddenly find themselves operating in a society where authority, hierarchy, and trust are expressed through completely different conversational signals. And if there is one place where this contrast becomes particularly visible, it is in business meetings that take place in Saudi Arabia, where patience, relational credibility, and social respect often carry more weight than the speed of the negotiation itself.
Exactly, and this is where many Western professionals, especially those coming from cultures like the United States or Germany, experience a kind of cultural whiplash because they're used to environments where efficiency is considered a form of respect, where meetings begin quickly, decisions are discussed directly, and time is treated almost like a currency that must be spent carefully. Whereas in Saudi business culture, the early moments of a meeting are rarely about the transaction itself, but about something much deeper, establishing relational trust.
And that's precisely why Saudi Arabia becomes such an interesting case study in what anthropologists call high-context communication. Because in a place like New York, the person who appears dominant in a meeting is often the one who speaks first, speaks quickly, and moves directly to the numbers. But in Riyadh, the perception of authority often emerges from a completely different signal: the ability to remain calm, present, and socially attentive without appearing rushed.
Right, and that difference can easily create misunderstandings when Western executives arrive expecting the meeting to function like a contract negotiation, while their Saudi counterparts are still evaluating something much more fundamental: who this person is, whether they respect the cultural hierarchy, and whether they are someone who can be trusted over the long term.
The simulation: coffee versus the contract. The scenario. So let's run a realistic simulation. Imagine an American technology executive named Sarah who has flown into Riyadh to finalize a partnership agreement. And because she has a return flight scheduled later that afternoon, she believes she has approximately 45 minutes to complete the conversation, review the contract details, and secure the signature she needs to move the project forward.
Meanwhile, the senior Saudi executive she is meeting, Mr. Al-Sayed, is approaching the meeting with a completely different timeline in mind, because for him, the primary objective of this first conversation is not to finalize paperwork, but to evaluate Sarah as a potential long-term partner, someone whose character, patience, and respect for social protocol will determine whether the business relationship should even proceed.
So Sarah begins the meeting with what seems, from her cultural perspective, like a perfectly efficient opening. Mr. Al-Sayed, thank you very much for seeing me today. I've brought the final version of the contract, and we've incorporated all the technical specifications your team requested. If we could just review page 12 together, we should be able to finalize the Q4 rollout this afternoon.
And from Sarah's perspective, that sentence sounds professional, organized, and respectful of everyone's time. Yet, in the cultural context of Saudi business etiquette, it accidentally communicates something quite different, because by pushing the contract onto the table immediately, she signals that the relationship itself is secondary to the transaction.
Mr. Al-Sayed smiles warmly, gently pushes the folder aside without opening it. Welcome to Riyadh, Sarah. Please have some coffee with us. I hope your journey was comfortable. Tell me, how long will you be staying in our city, and how is your family enjoying your travels?
And at this precise moment, we need to pause the simulation, because Sarah has just stepped into what intercultural communication experts call the urgency trap, where her attempt to move quickly toward the deal unintentionally lowers her perceived status in the room.
Exactly, because in many high-context cultures, the person who rushes toward the contract can appear impatient or transactional, almost like a salesperson pushing a product rather than a partner building a relationship, which means that by trying to save time, she has actually reduced the amount of influence she holds in the conversation.
And this is the moment where a culturally intelligent communicator must realize that the meeting is not being delayed, it is simply unfolding according to a different social rhythm.
Round 2, the status and respect adjustment. So let's rewind the simulation and imagine Sarah recognizing this shift in conversational tempo, allowing herself to slow down, relaxing her posture slightly, and deliberately placing the contract folder beside her, rather than directly in front of Mr. Al-Sayed.
And now she responds in a very different tone. The hospitality here has been wonderful, thank you. My family is doing very well, and they were actually quite curious about my visit to your beautiful city. I truly appreciate you taking the time to meet with me today, especially because I know your experience and perspective on this project will be extremely valuable for its success.
Mr. Al-Sayed nods slowly, visibly more engaged in the conversation. We appreciate your kind words. Our team has been reviewing several options recently, and of course, we are always interested in working with partners who bring strong expertise. Inshallah, if the path is right, we will find a way to collaborate.
And now something very subtle but extremely important has happened in the conversation, because Sarah shifted from a transactional tone to what communication scholars call status-building language, where she acknowledges the seniority and wisdom of the person she is speaking with, rather than simply focusing on the document she brought.
Exactly. And when Mr. Al-Sayed responds with the phrase, Inshallah, which literally means God willing, an inexperienced Western executive might panic and ask for a specific deadline or a definitive yes or no answer. Yet someone familiar with high-context communication understands that this phrase is part of a broader cultural rhythm where decisions emerge gradually rather than instantly.
And that means the real skill in that moment is not forcing clarity, but demonstrating patience. Because in this environment, trust is often built through conversation long before it is confirmed through signatures.
Which brings us to the most surprising lesson about dominance in Saudi boardrooms, because unlike in many Western corporate environments, where dominance can appear through speed, volume, or interruption, the true marker of authority here is the ability to remain calm and socially attentive without appearing impatient.
Exactly. Because if Sarah spends the next 20 minutes enjoying the coffee, asking thoughtful questions about the local market, and showing genuine curiosity about her host's perspective without repeatedly checking her watch, she is actually demonstrating something extremely important, that she respects the relationship enough to allow it to develop naturally.
And in many cases, that patience communicates more credibility than the most sophisticated business proposal ever could.
Which leads us to the paradox that surprises so many Western professionals when they first work in the region. The 20 minutes they think they are losing in polite conversation are actually the 20 minutes that determine whether the partnership will last for 5 years or collapse after the first contract.
In other words, in that Saudi boardroom, the real negotiation does not begin when the contract appears on the table.
It begins the moment someone pours the coffee.
So, here's the truth we've uncovered today. The strongest speaker in the room isn't the one with the biggest vocabulary or the loudest voice.
It's the one who controls the tempo. It's the one who knows when to use a time buyer, when to pivot, and when to let the silence do the heavy lifting.
Whether you're facing a dominant CEO in New York or navigating the high-context wisdom of a boardroom in Riyadh, remember, your English doesn't have to be perfect. Your positioning does.
You have the toolkit now. You have the conversational judo moves. The only thing left is to use them.
Before you head into your next meeting, we have a challenge for you. Pick one of the 5 phrases from our survival toolkit. Maybe it's the time buyer or the respectful challenge, and use it this week. Even if you don't need to, just to feel the power shift.
If you found today's deep dive valuable, do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button and leave us a review. It helps us keep dissecting the world's most intense conversations for you.
I'm Liam.
And I'm Emma.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Between the lines.